This evening is just a very, very personal family affair for many of us. It would have been very much for Carla. I wish she was here. Um, Alexandra and her brothers and her parents have been longtime members of the Politics and Prose family, um, as has Susan Shreve, who's going to be in conversation with Alex. Susan's daughter, Elizabeth, who has her own public relations firm here in Washington, is a close friend of Alex and has been very much uh, a, an advisor and stimulant for in writing this, getting the book keep on writing. Alex wonders in her book why her family never talked about the Zapruder film, and I have no recollection of her parents ever talking about it. With such a name as Zapruder, which has now permeated our culture such that it pops up on the New York Times crossword puzzle and in Jeopardy and Trivial Pursuits. It's a name that you can recognize that it must have something to do with the Zapruder film, but we never had any, Carla and I never had any conversation with any member of the Zapruder family, and we knew them all. Alex's brother Matthew, who is now the poetry editor of the New York Times Book Review. Matthew helped us carry books across the street, as did Alex and Alex's parents, as did Michael. But one of the reasons, certainly, that they wanted to maintain privacy, I'm sure, is that the fear of criticism, which was a legitimate fear, and it came, about the family charges of the family profiteering from the film. Alex began her research and writing career as a member of the founding staff of the Holocaust Memorial Museum after completing her undergraduate degree at Smith College and her master's degree in education from Harvard University. And then out of her work there at the Holocaust Museum, Alex began an independent project to research the diaries of written by teenagers during the Holocaust. And that resulted in the publication of her book, Salvaged Pages. This book won the National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category. She then wrote and co-produced a documentary film based on Salvaged Pages, which was nominated for 2 Emmy Awards. But when she plunged into researching the history of the Zapruder film, she entered into a world that was totally new to her. As I said, that in her family they never talked about the Zapruder film. And Abraham Zapruder, who took the film, he died when Alex was several months old. So she never really knew him. And so part of that new story to Alex was the story of her grandfather, Abraham Zapruder, who immigrated to this country as a child, fleeing Jewish persecution in Russia. In his adulthood, he was known as a sweet and gentle man. He was also known for his love of his movie camera and his love for President Kennedy, whose motorcade in Dallas would pass in full view of Abe's position a stone's throw from his dressmaking business in Dallas. His dressmaking business was called Jennifer Junior's. From the moment the shots were fired, that 26 seconds of film would become the center of decades of lawsuits filed over conspiracy theories, copyrights, intellectual property, and monetary value, ending in a binding arbitration in 1999. For the Zapruder family, this was 36 years in the spotlight after one sweet and gentle man engaging in his own personal hobby, filming a beloved president, inadvertently filmed 26 seconds that became the only film record of the assassination of President Kennedy. And then since then, that film has gone, the domain of that film has gone on into books like Don DeLillo's Underworld and movies such as Oliver Stone's film JFK. Alex is going to be talking about 26 Seconds with Susan Shreve. Susan is a professor of English at George Mason, as well as chairman of the Penn Faulkner Foundation. Alex writes in her book that Susan was among the first to encourage her idea of writing this book, as well as reading the first draft with many thoughtful comments. Excuse me. And then Alex goes on to say, this is a quote, "Her brilliant mind," that's Susan's, "her brilliant mind and generous heart are all over these pages." So here is Susan Shreve and Alex Zapruder to talk about 26 Seconds. They will talk about 35 minutes. We're going to take a short time for questions, maybe just about 10 minutes, and then we're going to do as quick a signing line as we can so Alex can get out of here to Morning Joe. But if you cannot get your book signed this evening, leave it at the register or at the information desk with a note of how that you would like it signed, and Alex will come back in later on this week and sign it just as you would like. So thank you for coming, and we're going to have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Susan.
Alex is going to read. Can you hear me? This wonderful group. It's a party. Alex is going to read first from the prologue, and then we'll be in conversation.
Hi, everyone. I have to do this. Can I have a show of hands of people who don't know me personally? Okay, that's very reassuring. Thanks for coming. Otherwise, this is a lot like my bat mitzvah or my wedding. I want to start by thanking, of course, the staff of Politics and Prose, Barbara, who came back to introduce me, which meant so much to me, Susan, for being in conversation with me, my wonderful agent, Gail, who is here, Gail Hockman, who is here, and especially my family, my mom, my husband, my children, my cousin, my aunt, dear family friends who've traveled to be here, and all of you, my wonderful friends. And I wanted to say one thing before I read, which is that I'm thinking of, in particular, of three people tonight, especially Carla Cohen, who so many of you knew and loved, and who I can just see her in the chair with her smile, beaming proudly as if this had been her idea, which is exactly how she would think of it, I think. And her husband, David, who we all loved so much and who I had hoped would be here this evening and we miss. And of course, most of all, my father, who so many of you knew and loved, who did not like to talk about the Zapruder film and who I think would be amazed and I hope gratified to see all of you here tonight. So thank you for being here. So I'm going to begin by reading from the prologue to the book. This is the opening. It's a scene when my grandfather returned to his home in Dallas after the assassination, after having spent most of the day getting it processed and developed. And this actually happened, but I've imagined the details of it to sort of set the stage for the book and to bring up many of the themes that run through it. So I'm going to read from it, and then Susan and I will have our conversation. Prologue, home movie. It was past 10 p.m. when Abe Zapruder pulled up in the driveway of his house on Marquette Street in the Highland Park suburb of Dallas. Exhausted and agitated, he turned the key in the ignition and pulled it out, sat for a moment in the darkened car, images of the day passing before his eyes. He dropped his head, disbelief washing over him yet again. His eyes felt dry and raw, his throat sore from screaming, his head aching. He had to go in. They had been waiting for him for hours. He reached over to the passenger side of the car and pulled the camera case by its long shoulder strap, the weight of it bumping across the seat, the silver buckle clattering. He reached for the bright yellow Kodak boxes in which the 8mm film reel and one duplicate had been hastily stashed. He grabbed his hat and put it on as he slid from the car, then slung the camera over his shoulder, cradled the films in his arm, and slammed the car door. His wife, Lillian, met him at the door. He looked at her face for a moment and shook his head. There were no words. Passing through the family room, he crossed the hallway with his wife following behind. In the dining room, the table wasn't set for dinner. Normally, his daughter, Myrna, and her husband, Myron, would have brought their 3 children for Friday night dinner. They would eat Lil's broiled chicken or a brisket, or maybe both, and they would discuss politics, arguing and talking, laughing. But not tonight. Tonight, as in homes all across the darkened landscape of America, this was a house of mourning. Now Abe moved about the house quickly. Where was the projector? Turning right, he darted into the den where Myrna and Myron were sitting, still in shock. He didn't stop to talk. All he could think about was the film. He dug around in the closet until he found the projector and the screen. He yanked them out and began setting them up. Lillian stood nearby, uncharacteristically silent, reading her husband of 30 years, the man she had loved since she was a teenager in Brooklyn. Now was not the time to push him. He began threading the film through the projector and onto the take-up reel. Myrna's face registered comprehension. "I can't watch that," she said. "I don't want to see it." He didn't blame her, but he had to do it. He didn't know when the thought had come to him. He just knew that all during the long, incomprehensible day, he had been thinking that he needed to get home, to see his family. He needed to show them his film. A few minutes later, they were ready. Abe at the projector, Lil and Myron seated nervously on the couch. Myrna retreated to the living room weeping, her head buried in the couch pillows. The den had been his son Henry's room, and it was here that Abe always showed the home movies, projected against the stand-up screen. He had been taking home movies for nearly 30 years. Myrna as a baby in Brooklyn, his wife and family at the beach in Far Rockaway, Henry toddling on a city sidewalk, then later the children riding bikes in Dallas. Hours of unexceptional films spanning the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Home movies that caught the past, their parents now dead, the streets of Jewish Brooklyn changed, his young children grown and married. Only this time, he and his family weren't telling stories and talking and remembering. The room was completely silent but for the clicking of the film running through the projector. The first frames appear. 2 of his grandchildren playing in a backyard suburban scene, green grass and a small white patio with a lounge chair in the background. There is the baby, David, in blue gingham overall shorts, toddling toward the camera with his mischievous smile and eyes that crinkle into half crescents when he laughs. The film is silent, but his mouth forms the word, Papa. Then there is Jeff, the eldest, long and lean, digging in the grass. The scene changes. Abe is inside at Jennifer Jr.'s, his dress manufacturing company. Lillian Rogers, his longtime assistant and trusted friend, is fooling around, talking on the phone and pretending to make him wait. Seconds later, he zooms in slowly on her face and catches her in an unguarded moment, smiling girlishly at him. Then the image fades out. The screen flickers again, and they are in bright sunshine outside on Dealey Plaza. He remembers making some test shots and adjusting the settings. How he loved that camera. He loved anything that ran efficiently and well. In another life, he would have been an engineer instead of a dressmaker. Maybe if he had been born here instead of in Tsarist Russia. Maybe if he had gotten a proper education instead of going to night school in America to learn English and getting by on his brains and wits. But such was life and chance. There are his employees, Charles and Beatrice Hester, seated at the pergola at Dealey Plaza, and his receptionist, Marilyn Sitzman. He had tried a number of spots before she turned up and noticed a 4-foot wall that he could stand on. It would be perfect, offering him just the vantage point he wanted, looking down on Elm Street, able to follow the motorcade perfectly from left to right as it sailed past him. Here are the first frames. The lead motorcycles rounding the corner of Houston onto Elm. He remembers again that his heart had skipped a beat when they came into view, but that he had stopped filming when he realized that it wasn't the motorcade yet. He wanted to save the film, to make sure he got it all. He would capture the president's beaming smile and a glimpse of his glamorous wife, whose style the women in his own family tried to emulate. One day he would show it to his grandchildren. "That's Jack Kennedy," he would say. "There's Jackie. Look at them smiling and waving. Aren't they beautiful? We loved them. We thought of them like our own family." Finally, the long, dark cars came into view. He remembers the moment lifting the camera to his eye and pressing the button. No more fiddling. He gripped his forearm, steadying the hand holding the camera, and trained his eye on the open limousine. There they were. He was going to get the whole thing from his perch above Elm Street. They were going to pass right in front of him. The light was excellent, the green grass behind the black car, the First Lady in a pink hat. They came closer, and he could see them perfectly. It had all happened so fast, now he couldn't fully match up the sounds he had heard with what he saw. The president was smiling and waving, then Abe lost sight of him for a second or two behind a street sign. When he came out the other side, something seemed wrong. His wrists were up around his throat, and then he slumped over to the side toward the First Lady. Abe didn't understand what he was seeing. He was paralyzed, watching through the lens. As he struggled to focus, there was another sharp crack, and inside the car, an explosion. It couldn't be, but it was. It was the most horrific thing he had ever seen. He was utterly frozen, his mind trying to register what had happened. There was a pink streak on the back of the car, the First Lady in her suit. What was she doing? She was shoved back inside, back into that bloody horror, and then they were gone. This was how he had known before anyone else. He had seen it magnified through the zoom lens. There was no way the president could have survived. And yet it seemed like hours before everyone else knew. It was like being in a nightmare, trying to scream but finding that you couldn't make a sound. He was alone with his certainty, shaken to his core, shocked and horrified that such a thing could happen in America. In Russia, where he had come from, yes. There anyone could be pulled off a train and beaten to death or shot on the street. That was why his family had come here, to escape that barbaric violence and find a place in a democratic country. How could this have happened here in America in the 20th century? His stunned wife and son-in-law sat numbly on the couch, unable to speak. The silence was interrupted by the ringing of the phone. Who could it be at this hour? Reporters again? He had been given several hasty offers to buy the film but had refused, saying that he needed to make sure it reached the federal authorities. He had seen to that, but now what? The press was not going to give up, not when they realized that he was in possession of his pictures and at liberty to sell them. The phone kept ringing, insistent. "Abe," Lillian asked, "should I answer?" His heart sank again for the 100th time, thinking of Jackie Kennedy and imagining the footage crossing her path. Would he be the cause of further pain and suffering for her and her family? Should he sell it? To whom? He could already imagine the images splashed all over the news, on the television. The thought was sickening. Choices upon choices, none of them good. He should let the phone ring. He should wait and deal with whatever it was tomorrow. But he didn't. He walked into the kitchen, dazed, and picked up the receiver.
Alex, this is really an exciting and wonderful moment, and I'm thrilled. Can you hear?
Can you hear? Okay.
I was talking at the wrong side. This is rather typical of me. This is a wonderful moment, and I've been really thrilled to have an association with the book because it was part of my very young adulthood and this terrible event. And one of the things that struck me even then was who was this man who managed to see what he saw and hold his hands steady?
So, as Barbara said, I didn't know my grandfather, but I learned an enormous amount about him from the research that I did for this book, for talking to my mother and to my aunt and to other people who knew him. I mean, he had come to this country as a 15-year-old boy from Imperial Russia. His mother was the one who really raised him and his 3 siblings. They lived in abject poverty, I think it would be fair to say, and suffered enormous persecution and oppression, as did all Jews living in that particular place and time. And then he came here at 15 and made a life for himself as an American. And I think my sense of him is that he loved this country and that he felt that this country had been enormously good to him, and that it was because of being in America that he was able to achieve all the things that he did. He became a dressmaker, and he had an enormous amount of natural talent and natural ability. He could play music. He never had a lesson, but he played perfectly by ear. He was great he tinkered around the house all the time. I mean, I think inside the family, there's some wry humor about his abilities, that he was very talented, and yet sometimes his projects went a little south. But that he was very endearing and very, very, very much loved by the people who knew him. And very funny, extremely funny. He loved to tell jokes and stories.
You really see this in reading the book, and also are struck by, as we all have been always, by this ordinary man who happened to be at a time, as he said, at the wrong place at the wrong time. This Zapruder film was an accident. But when we watch it now, and we do over and over again, it is as if we are seeing it for the first time, and we have that sense of urgency that this time the story will come out differently, as if we don't know what happens next. So 26 seconds lives as a moment in real time that changed the course of history. What happened that day?
So, immediately following the assassination, of course, as I said in the prologue, my grandfather knew exactly what had happened. There was no question in his mind, and he was dazed and sort of crying hysterically on the plaza together with all the other people who were there, and was approached by Harry McCormick, who was a Dallas Morning News reporter, who saw him with the camera and said, like any reporter would, what do you have there, sir? And he said, I think that moment was a real moment of clarity for him. And he said, I won't talk to anybody but the federal authorities, knowing that he had to get this into the hands of the federal government. And so Harry McCormick went off to locate Forrest Sorrells, who was the head of the Secret Service in Dallas, and my grandfather went back to his office. And then the whole first chapter of the book, really, and into the second chapter, sort of traces the journey of getting the film processed that day, which was 8mm film was typically sent out to Rochester to be developed to the Kodak labs. So to find a place to do it in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination in Dallas was extremely difficult. It took all day, first to WFAA TV, where they couldn't do it, then to the Kodak labs to get the film processed, then to Jameson Film Company to get duplicates made, then back to Kodak labs to get those duplicates processed, and then to the Secret Service to deliver 2 of the 4, the original and 3 duplicates. 2 of the duplicates then went to the Secret Service, and 1 was flown to Washington by plane that night.
One of the interesting things here in terms of the film and that particular day was his presence of mind, that he was able to be in shock and actually at the same time make such incredibly sensible, measured decisions.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
can you hold the mic closer to your mouth?
To my mouth,
That would
okay.
help a lot, thank you.
I'm not. I'm used to the ones that stand up. I have to eat it, thank you. It looks delicious. When you were first telling me about the book, you talked about the ambiguities in the story, and you have not shirked addressing them. You wanted to understand the differences between our culture and the culture of the Kennedy years by following the complicated, convoluted life of them, especially as it relates to the media. This is such a thoroughly researched book, and it has a quality of both mystery and excitement. What next? What's this? It turns so many corners. It's quite an astonishing work of research. So talk to me about this culture and that culture.
one of the things that one of the ways in which this project sort of came about, that's distracting. Just kidding, Hannah, I'm just kidding. One of the ways that this came about for me was that when in the aftermath of my father's death, I felt something of a sense of responsibility to try to collect the material records that we had in our family about the film and put them together. And then in order to do that, I had to educate myself and interview people and just try to pull the material together. And in order to do that, I had to learn about the history of the film. So I read what there was to read about it. And one of the things that kept emerging was these gaps, missing information. And the gap between the way that the media handled the film in the time and the way that it might handle the film now was one of those things that I felt could be explained in certain ways by the time. So, for example, what I'm thinking of is that my grandfather sold the film to Life magazine the day after the assassination. He chose Life magazine because he felt that they could be trusted. He liked and respected Richard Stolley, who was the young reporter that he met. And he really entrusted the film to them. They had a gentleman's agreement. And one of the clauses in the agreement was that Life magazine would treat the film with dignity and restraint, which, I mean, can we just take a minute? That is the kind of thing that, when you see it in the context of our time, and that was before, the thing that just happened, that it really stood out. It was this enormous sort of like, what is this? This has to be about the time. This has to be about, a completely different time. And one of the things that was interesting about that as well was that Life magazine for years was criticized for withholding the film from the American people. But the more I looked into it, the more I felt that I understood that it was so much in the nature of this agreement between my grandfather and Life magazine that weighed on the executives at Life magazine and shaped many of their decisions. And this was one of those sort of things that kind of a Zapruder would know, but that no one else would know. How would you wouldn't know that if you didn't know who he was and if the story hadn't been handed down in a certain way. So I'm not sure that totally answered your question, but I said the word media.
And it certainly, I mean, we're living in such a different time. This would never happen now. And so there's something very fascinating, these cultural relationships. And of course, as you say, in relief right now, given what is going on. I'm also extremely interested in some of you started by talking about the fact that it had a value. What is the value? How is the value determined? And your grandfather did some very interesting things along the way. And talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this was the big, really, this was the hard thing to deal with because the film in and of itself carries an inherent conflict. It's important and it was significant in its time, but it was also valuable. It was financially valuable. And how can you in any way cope with the possibility that you might be profiting from a national tragedy of this kind? And yet, when faced with the reality of possessing this item, what is one to do? So my grandfather was immediately, how he understood it, I don't know, but it's clear that he understood immediately that this was going to be the central problem of this film. Not that it was going to be the subject of enormous conspiracy theories, he couldn't have known that then. Not that it was going to be the grandfather of citizen journalism, not that it was going to be in Don DeLillo's novel and that it was going to occasion questions about the reality of visual truth in film and all the other things that happen, but simply that what to do with it. What if you sell it, you're making money. If you make money, that's incredibly distasteful and horrible. And yet, on the other hand. So for me, that was the thing that kept me from, that was the thing I hesitated about. I wasn't sure I wanted to go there, to be perfectly honest. But what I found was that there was a way to, how can I say this? There was a way to sort of dwell in that terrain without judgment, but to really dig into all the questions and all the possibilities and explore them and consider what was true and what had actually happened and what the choices were that he faced and then in later years that our family faced and in particular that my father faced. And that was the only way to do it, really, was to just, in a way, was to do it and to be, in a way, to be sort of fearless about it and to say these are my questions. These are the questions of this. No one else is going to be able to struggle with them in this particular way and take these things on so personally, but at the same time, I need to have faith in my family and in my grandfather and my father that, whatever they did and whatever choices they made, that their humanity would prevail, which I believe it did.
And certainly it's in the book, the number of things that they did do to follow the law, your grandfather giving to the widow.
Right. So so what Susan's alluding to is that my grandfather, he felt tremendous ambivalence about selling the film at all, even to Life magazine. And yet he did sell it for what was a very large sum of money, $150,000 at the time. And it is a lot of money. It's a lot of money. It was a lot of money then. It's a lot of money now. And he felt, I think he felt deeply ambivalent about it. And so one of the things that he decided to do, and in addition to entrusting it to Life, which was a big part of this, was to give away the first installment of the money to the widow of J.D. Tippett, who was the police officer who was killed by Oswald in the movie theater. And this was a way for him to both do what he felt he needed to do for his family and for himself, to accept the money and yet try in some way to do something with it for the good of someone else in order to kind of walk that line and find the balance. And I think this is a story about, at least for our family, there's a much bigger public story, but for our family, I think it's always been about finding that balance. Where's the line? People who know my father are nodding.
Yeah. There's this wonderful story that I heard that happened in a philosophy seminar, in which the philosopher teaching the seminar asked, talking about the value of art, asked, what if there were a fire in the Louvre and the Mona Lisa burned, but there was a wonderful reproduction of the Mona Lisa? Which would be of more value, the ash, which you could visit at the Louvre, or the reproduction? And everyone replied, the ash. And I think that the whole question of the value of the original intellectual property, there were many reproductions. You can see it all over the internet. But the value of the original as a work of art, because art encompasses all. So talk about the whole question.
This is I think this is such a great, that's such a great way to introduce this part of the story, because in the 1990s, the original film was taken from our family by the federal government, as many of you may know, as part of the JFK Act. And there was a long period of time where my father was really trying to persuade the government not to take the film, to accept a high resolution, the highest resolution and quality reproduction of the film, because he felt we had entrusted the film, it was in safekeeping at the National Archives, but he felt that the American taxpayers shouldn't pay just compensation for the original Zapruder film, which was surely going to be a large sum of money. And it goes to this question, which I really tried to deal with in the book. What is it about the original? What was it about the original film that the people who were making the decision felt that it had to be in the possession of the American people, even though the data could be more. You can't run the film through a projector. The film has absolutely no sort of visual value anymore. It is purely symbolic, and yet the people who were making this decision felt that for so many reasons the original film had to belong to the American people, and decided in the end to take it, which then led to this very interesting moment, this arbitration hearing in which experts, on both sides tried to argue, what is the value of the original Zapruder film, which is a question that has to do with art. It has to do with artifacts, trying to find some type of comparable item. What is comparable to it? What is something that is completely unique and that stands for all these different things? So the last chapter of the book really, in getting into this, it almost becomes sort of a way of laying out sort of what is the Zapruder film beyond just itself, but what does it mean to us, and how, and that most American of questions, how does what it means translate into a dollar figure, which is ultimately what was trying to be resolved.
But I think the whole sense of it, and one of the great things about writing the book at this moment, when we have an arc of history, a sense of when that happened, what happened in the world at that time, how important it was all over the world, to this moment, and to the great change in what communication is about and what the visual image is about. I think that one has in this book a marvelous sense of history in the very best way.
Thank you.
We are speedy because of our television star. So I'd like to end with the existential question of what remains when we read the epilogue and put down the book. And so to close, and in your own words, would you read that paragraph on page? Yeah.
This one to here.
That one. I have to put on my glasses to see.
That's the one you want.
I think I do. Yeah.
It's the top. This right here, right? The conundrum one, or this one? Sorry.
That one, isn't it? That ends.
Yes. Stripped from us so quickly.
Yeah.
Okay. The deepest, most compelling. This is a paragraph about the conundrums that are, or the conundra that are, I don't know, that are inherent in the film. And the last one that I'm writing about here is the existential one that Susan was mentioning. The Zapruder film is in every way a conundrum. It contains its own irreconcilable contradictions. It is visual evidence that refuses to solve the mystery of who murdered the president, why, and how. It is a single strip of film in which we all see different things. It shows the entire course of history changing under the influence of a single bullet. It is quite possibly the most important historical film ever made, and yet it is an amateur home movie. It is 6 feet of 8mm film on a plastic reel that turned out to be worth $16 million. It is the most private and the most public of records. It is gruesome and terrible, but we cannot stop looking at it. But more than that, the deepest, most compelling conundrum of the film is an existential one. It lies in the arc of the film itself, the fall from grace, the unforgiving inevitability of it. It is a sunny day. A handsome husband and his beautiful wife are riding down the street, smiling and waving, with their lives stretched out before them. And within less than half a minute, his head explodes and he is dead, and she is covered in his brains and blood, trying to recover his skull from the trunk of the limousine. He is alive and then he is dead. She is a wife and then she is a widow. She is grace itself and then she is sprawled across the back of the car. How can it be that our protections and illusions can be stripped from us so quickly?
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Susan. All right, so are we gonna, what time is it? Yeah.
Questions. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. 2 microphones, one here, one here.
They're very strict about the microphones here. You have to-
Sorry, my question's sort of quick. In the mid-'70s, they started showing the Zapruder film publicly. They showed it in our college in all the dorms. What happened that enabled them to start showing the film
Great.
at that time?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. Those showings that you're referring to were bootleg copies of the film. So this was in the late 1960s. First Jim Garrison, no, not first. First a gentleman named Robert Grodin, and then Jim Garrison, who was the DA in New Orleans, got copies of the film and bootlegged them and distributed them. And there was a very significant sort of conspiracy movement that was growing up around the country. And so the film was shown specifically by organizations that were going to college campuses and churches and showing it in order to basically blow the lid off of the federal government's suppression of the film. And what ultimately happened as a result of that pressure on Life magazine was, well, first that Geraldo Rivera aired the film for the first time on national television, a pirated copy of it. And then as a consequence of that, Life magazine returned the film to our family for $1 in 1975.
Like so many others, I probably have watched this at least 100 times. And as Susan said, or you perhaps expressed in your opening, each time I want a different ending. One of my questions always is, when watching the film, can that first sign be somehow removed to actually see what took place at that particular millisecond? And that's, every time I watch it, that's what captivates me, is that particular moment.
And what this gentleman's referring to is that the car passes behind a street sign, and when the president goes behind the sign, he looks like he's fine, and when he comes out, he clearly has been shot, and it's impossible to pinpoint the moment, although God knows people have tried to pinpoint the very moment when that first shot might have been fired. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, come on.
A couple things. One is I heard Dan Rather was involved with the film on that day. Secondly, decades later, there was a lot of talk about the film having been doctored, the film that we saw. I was just wondering if you could talk about either of these things.
Sure. Dan Rather was involved in the sense that he was there on, the print rights to the film were sold on the day after the assassination, as I said, and then 2 days later, my grandfather sold the moving picture rights also to Life magazine. But at that time, there were many, many, many journalists and television reporters who showed up ostensibly to bid on the film, and Dan Rather was one of those young reporters. And I wrote in the book, and this was a somewhat difficult decision for me to write about because Dan Rather really behaved quite badly, I'm afraid, in that moment. And I didn't particularly relish the idea of calling him out, but the reality is that he saw the film. There was a confidentiality agreement. There was an agreement that anyone who saw the film in that moment wouldn't report on what they had seen, and he then went back to the television station at CBS and reported on what he had seen. And because he misremembered what he saw and recounted it inaccurately, it spawned many, many, many conspiracy theories, and they may have happened anyway, but people began to believe that perhaps Dan Rather had seen the real film, and the film that eventually made its way into the American public's consciousness was not that one. What was your second one? I just lost it. Oh, the doctrine. So there is a school of thought, there are people who are known as the alterationists who believe that the film, it's catchy, don't you think? That believe that the film was altered the weekend of the assassination, which is, and I did spend some time on this in the book because, partly because it strikes me as so kind of outlandish that it kind of goes shows the very, very, very farthest reaches that the conspiracy thinking, which some of which is perfectly legitimate, but where it can go. The film was not doctored, as far as I know. I never have found any evidence of that. But what did happen is that the film was damaged at Life magazine the very weekend of the assassination, and Life magazine failed to disclose that information for a long time. And several frames were lost from the original film, although they were present on the duplicates that had been made on the first day. And so that was another one of those things that led to these rumors and theories. But there were a great many of things that happened. In a way, I keep thinking this is a story about unintended consequences and the way that, things happen and then they take on a life of their own. Yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, aside from proving that Kennedy was killed, did the film ever give evidence or insight into who killed him? No, couldn't.
I mean, the film does not show something that everyone can agree upon, for one thing. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think it has stayed so much in the American consciousness is because of that. Because it is both the record of the president's murder, and yet it doesn't answer the pressing questions that it asks. Who did it? Where were the bullets coming from?
It doesn't establish where the bullets were coming from the depository.
I mean, it depends on who you ask. Many people think that it establishes exactly that, and equally many people believe that because of the way that the president's head moves at the time of the fatal shot, that he must have been shot from the front. And I really tried to trace this in the book and educate myself on this subject, because of all the things that we didn't talk about when it came to the Zapruder film, certainly this was the least interesting topic in our family, was really the sort of mechanics of what happened to the president. It seemed very gruesome, and I can understand why. But so I really had to educate myself about that. But it does not, I don't think it can be, I mean, one way of saying it is that it doesn't prove anything. The other way of saying it is that it proves everything. Sure.
Okay, my curiosity is piqued because, before I do that, just one quick supplement to what you said. I guess Mark Furman pointed out in his book on the Kennedy assassination that the film was only shot from one angle.
Yes.
So if you shot from a different angle,
Right.
you might get something very. But okay,
Yeah.
my curiosity piqued. I have at home a VCR or beta or whatever, or I can't remember the name, a documentary on the Zapruder film, and includes, for example, part of the Geraldo Rivera show, all kinds of different versions of the Zapruder film, several other home cameras were shot, and says some nice things about your grandfather. And do you know anything about this documentary? Or?
I think, is it called Image of an Assassination?
I'm
Is
not
that the
sure.
one? Because there was one that was an authorized sort of reproducing of the film with supplemental material that our family knew about and helped to provide and to put together. And the reason that this happened in the 1990s was that, first of all, there was enormous pressure to make the film available to a wider audience. That's really the main reason. The film, it was already we were in the 1990s, and people were clamoring to see it, and yet the technology hadn't developed to where it is now, that the film could be emailed or could be on the internet. I mean, there was no internet, right? There was no internet. So, I mean, there was an internet, but we didn't have access to it. So the only way that people could get copies of the film was to request them from my father, which was tremendously burdensome for him and complicated. So ultimately, that decision was made to try to make it available to more people in that way.
Do you think your grandfather was surprised that he was the only one that captured it?
So it's interesting. He actually wasn't the only one. I mean, he was the only one who captured the sort of whole story from beginning to end. But there were, and people are always surprised to hear this, there were 21 other photographers there at the time in that area. And if you put all of those images together, you get a lot more data if you're someone who's trying to figure out exactly what happened. But yeah, I think he was very surprised. I think he was surprised by everything about it. I think he was surprised that it happened. I think he was surprised that he was able to keep filming. I think he was surprised that it became so famous. I think he was dismayed and mortified by all of those things. He wasn't someone who ever, and neither was my father, someone who ever took even an iota of pride or pleasure in it. It was always felt that, this was a tragedy, and it was a tragedy to be associated with it, and, that was very real for him. It's different in our generation, but it was very true for them, for sure.
How did it change his life afterwards? Did he keep filming?
I think, my mother would know better if it changed his life since she knew him, but I think he was definitely traumatized. I think by today's standards we would call it, post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares and was very, very anxious around the time of the assassination, every year, the anniversary. He didn't take films very much, not anything like he had done before, but he did towards the end of his life take a few films again. And he said, there's a beautiful, very sad quote actually from an interview that he gave in 1966, in which he said, I have these beautiful grandchildren growing up, and I'd love to, take pictures of them, but I just can't bring myself to do it. I can't bring myself to look through the lens of a camera again. And he did eventually, I think, do that, but I think it absolutely, it changed it forever, and obviously not for the better.
I think we're good. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. This was a wonderful event.